In the vast expanse of the galaxy, where civilizations rise and fall like waves upon cosmic shores, there exists a truth that echoes through the void. When the strong prey upon the weak, only the truly brave dare to stand against the tide. This is not a tale of conquest or glory, but of a species that refused to let cruelty define the universe's moral compass.
When an entire race faced extinction not from war or disease but from the calculated indifference of those who called themselves civilized, humanity made a choice that would forever alter the galaxy's understanding of what it means to be truly advanced. Some say courage is born from desperation.
Others believe it springs from righteousness. But perhaps, just perhaps, it emerges from the simple recognition that in a universe where life is precious and rare, no being should face the darkness alone.
Captain Elena Vasquez stared at the holographic display floating before her command chair, her dark eyes reflecting the pale blue light of distant stars. The bridge of the UES Defiance hummed with quiet efficiency, but something in the routine sensor sweeps had caught her attention.
What should have been empty space according to all galactic charts showed signs of artificial structures. Lieutenant Chen, run those scans again, she ordered, leaning forward. And this time use the deep-range sensors. David Chen's fingers danced across his console with practiced precision. As the ship's chief science officer, he had learned to trust his captain's instincts over the years. The enhanced scans painted a different picture entirely, one that made his breath catch in his throat.
Captain, I'm detecting massive orbital platforms.
At least 12 of them, each one roughly the size of a small moon. But according to the Galactic Council's navigation database, this system is listed as uninhabited. Elena frowned. In her 15 years of service with the human expeditionary fleet, she had learned that such discrepancies usually meant trouble. The galaxy was vast, but the major powers maintained meticulous records of inhabited systems, if only to avoid diplomatic incidents. Any response to our standard greeting protocols? She asked. Negative. But Captain, I'm picking up something else. These platforms, they're not just inhabited. They're overcrowded. I'm reading population densities that should be impossible to sustain. Before Elena could respond, the communications console erupted in a burst of static. Through the interference, a voice emerged, weak, desperate, but unmistakably intelligent. Unknown vessel, please respond. This is Sanctuary Platform 7 of the HFY refugee fleet. We haven't had contact with anyone beyond our own people in over 3 standard years. Please, if you can hear this, we need help. Elena exchanged glances with her first officer, Commander James Morrison. In all their years exploring the galaxy's outer reaches, they had never encountered anything quite like this. The voice carried a weight of exhaustion that spoke of prolonged suffering. Open a channel, Elena commanded. This is Captain Elena Vasquez of the United Earth ship Defiance. We receive your transmission, Sanctuary Platform 7. What is your situation? The pause that followed seemed to stretch for an eternity. When the response came, it carried a note of disbelief that was almost heartbreaking. Earth? The humans? But no. One speaks to us anymore. The Council decreed us non-persons. You shouldn't even be able to detect us through our cloaking fields. Elena felt a chill run down her spine. The Galactic Council, dominated by the 4 major species, the militaristic Drakmor, the technocratic Zephyrians, the economic powerhouse known as the Veltar, and the enigmatic Ethereals, rarely made such extreme declarations. For an entire species to be declared non-persons suggested something catastrophic had occurred. We're detecting you just fine, Elena replied carefully. And as far as I know, humanity isn't bound by any council decree regarding your people. May I ask who I'm speaking with? My name is Thane Kalamor, last elected representative of the HFY Democratic Assembly. Captain, I must warn you. If the council discovers you've made contact with us, they may extend their sanctions to humanity as well. We've been forgotten by choice. Elena's jaw tightened. Throughout her career, she had witnessed the council's bureaucratic coldness, but deliberately forgetting an entire species crossed a line she hadn't known existed. Mr. Kalamor, with your permission, I'd like to arrange a face-to-face meeting. My ship has adequate diplomatic facilities, and I believe this conversation requires more privacy than an open channel can provide. Another long pause followed. Elena could almost feel the internal debate taking place on the other end of the transmission. Captain, I must be honest with you. What you're proposing could be seen as an act of aggression by the Council. The Kethavar have been declared a threat to galactic stability. Association with us is discouraged. Elena stood up from her command chair, her decision crystallizing with each word. Mr. Kellamore, in my experience, the only real threat to galactic stability is the willingness to abandon principles when it becomes convenient. I'm sending you docking coordinates now. The next few hours passed in careful preparation. Elena's crew worked with the quiet efficiency that came from years of operating in the galaxy's frontier regions, but she could sense their curiosity. The HFY were known to most spacers only as legends, a species that had supposedly vanished from galactic civilization decades ago. When Thane Kalamor materialized in the Defiance's transporter bay, Elena was struck first by how human-like the HFY appeared. Slightly taller than average humans, with elongated limbs and graceful movements, their most distinctive features were the intricate patterns of bioluminescent markings that traced along their arms and face. These patterns pulsed gently, apparently responding to emotional states. But it was the exhaustion in Kalamor's bearing that truly caught Elena's attention. This was a being who had carried too much weight for too long. "Captain Vasquez," Kalamor said, his voice carrying the same weariness she had detected over the communications link. "I cannot adequately express how unexpected this moment is. It has been so long since anyone from the greater galaxy has looked upon a HFY with anything other than disdain or fear." Elena extended her hand in the human greeting she had learned worked with most species. "The pleasure is mine, Representative Kalamor. Please, let's move to more comfortable quarters where we can speak freely." In the ship's diplomatic lounge, surrounded by the soft glow of Earth's historical artifacts and star charts, Kalamor began to tell a story that would fundamentally change Elena's understanding of galactic civilization. 47 standard years ago, he began. The HFY were considered one of the galaxy's most promising species. We had achieved interstellar flight only recently, but our democratic traditions and peaceful nature made us popular among the council races. We were even granted preliminary membership status. Kalamor's bioluminescent patterns dimmed as he continued. Our mistake was believing that our principles were shared by others. When the Drakmor began their expansion into what they called unclaimed territories that happened to be the traditional hunting grounds of several non-spacefaring species, we spoke out. We called for protection of these beings, for recognition of their rights even though they couldn't defend themselves in council chambers. Elena poured tea from her personal reserve, noting how Kalamor's hands trembled slightly as he accepted the cup. "I take it the council didn't appreciate your advocacy. At first they simply ignored us. The Drakmor claimed the territories were empty. The Zephyrians provided scientific justifications for colonization. The Veltar calculated the economic benefits, and the Ethereals, well, they remained silent as always. But we had proof. We had documented evidence of intelligent life, of cultures that deserved protection." The tea seemed to steady Kalamor, and his patterns brightened slightly. "When we threatened to take our evidence to the broader galactic community, the council made us an offer: withdraw our complaints, accept a substantial compensation package, and continue as a valued member of galactic civilization. Refuse and face the consequences of obstructing legitimate expansion." Elena felt her anger building. She had dealt with council politics before, but this level of calculated cruelty was beyond anything she had experienced. "And you refused."
"We voted as a people."
Every adult HFY participated in the decision. 87% chose to stand by our principles, even knowing the cost. We released our evidence to every species we could contact, called for justice, demanded protection for those who couldn't protect themselves. Kalamor's patterns flared brighter, and Elena realized she was seeing anger rather than exhaustion for the first time. The council's response was swift and devastating. They didn't declare war. That would have attracted too much attention. Instead, they declared us mentally unstable as a species, suffering from what they called empathy psychosis. They claimed our concern for other beings was a sign of psychological breakdown that made us dangerous to galactic stability. The implications hit Elena like a physical blow. They pathologized your compassion. Precisely. Overnight, we became non-persons. Our trade agreements were voided. Our embassy staff were expelled from council space. Any ship that aided us was subject to sanctions. Within 5 years, we had lost our homeworld to Dr. Moore protective occupation and been forced to flee in whatever vessels we could construct. Elena set down her teacup with more force than necessary. "How many of you are left?" "When we fled, we numbered nearly 8 billion. Now, Kalamor's patterns dimmed to barely visible glimmers, perhaps 200 million scattered across 12 mobile platforms like the one you found. We've been running for 4 decades, Captain. Running from a galaxy that decided our capacity for compassion made us unsuitable for civilization." The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Elena found herself thinking of Earth's own history, of the times when those in power had declared entire populations inferior or dangerous simply for refusing to abandon their values. "The species you tried to protect?" she asked quietly. What happened to them? Gone. The single word carried the weight of civilizations. Every culture we tried to save was absorbed into Drakmor territory. The Council's official records list them as successful integration projects. We have fragments of their stories preserved in our archives, but their voices have been silenced. Elena stood and walked to the viewing port, staring out at the distant platforms that housed the remnants of a people who had chosen principle over survival. Behind her, she heard Kalamor continue. We have tried to rebuild, to find some corner of the galaxy where we might exist in peace. But we are hunted, Captain, not by armies or weapons, but by indifference. Every species knows that helping us brings Council attention. Every planet understands that harboring us means economic isolation. We have become the galaxy's untouchables, and our only crime was believing that compassion should guide civilization rather than convenience. Elena turned back to face the Kethvar representative.
What do you need? I beg your pardon, your people. What do you need to survive, to thrive? Food, medical supplies, technical assistance. What would it take for the Kethvar to have a real chance at rebuilding their civilization? Kalamor stared at her, his patterns shifting through what Elena was beginning to recognize as confusion and hope fighting for dominance.
Captain, you don't understand. Helping us means challenging the entire Council system. It means risking humanity's position in galactic society. We cannot ask that of you.
Elena smiled for the first time since the conversation began, and it was not a pleasant expression. Representative Kalamor, you seem to be under the impression that you're asking.
You're not. I'm offering. And frankly, after 47 years of running, I think you've earned the right to be a little selfish. As if summoned by her words, Commander Morrison appeared at the lounge entrance.
Elena nodded for him to enter. Jim, I want you to hear this, all of it.
And when Representative Kellamore finishes his story, I want you to help me figure out how humanity can make the Council remember what they tried so hard to forget. Kellamore's patterns blazed with an intensity Elena hadn't seen before, and she realized she was witnessing something that might be the Kethvar equivalent of tears.
Captain, he whispered, do you truly understand what you're suggesting? Your species is young, still finding its place among the stars.
We are already lost. Why would you risk everything for people you've just met?
Elena exchanged a look with Morrison, seeing her own determination reflected in his eyes. When she spoke, her voice carried the conviction of someone who had found their true purpose. Because, Representative Kellamore, sometimes being human means standing up for what's right, even when everyone else has decided it's easier to look away.
And if the galaxy has forgotten that compassion is strength rather than weakness, then maybe it's time someone reminded them. The meeting continued deep into the ship's night cycle, as Kellamore shared details of Kethvar technology, culture, and current resources. Elena learned of brilliant scientists working in makeshift laboratories, of artists creating beauty from salvaged materials, of children being born and raised on platforms that were never meant for permanent habitation. She also learned of the Kethvar's remarkable achievements, despite their circumstances. Their forced nomadic existence had led to innovations in sustainable technology, closed-loop ecosystems, and resource optimization that surpassed anything in Council space. Their democratic traditions had evolved into sophisticated consensus-building practices that could serve as models for any civilization. Most importantly, she learned that the Kethvar had never abandoned their core principles. Despite 4 decades of persecution, they continued to rescue and protect other displaced beings they encountered. Their platforms housed not just Kethvar refugees, but dozens of other species that had fallen through the cracks of galactic civilization.
Representative, Elena said as their marathon session drew to a close, I need to contact Earth. This decision is too important for one ship captain to make alone.
But I want you to know that I will personally recommend that humanity formally recognize the Kethvar as an independent nation deserving of our protection and alliance. Kellamore's patterns had stabilized into what Elena was learning to read as cautious optimism. If your leaders are anything like you, Captain, then perhaps the galaxy is not as dark as we had believed. As Elena escorted Kellamore back to the transporter bay, she felt the weight of history settling on her shoulders. Humanity had always prided itself on being the species that stood up for the underdog, that refused to abandon hope even in the darkest circumstances.
If the Kethvar story was true, and every instinct told her it was, then this was humanity's chance to prove that their ideals weren't just words.
Representative, she said as they reached the transporter platform, there's one more thing I need to know.
In all your years of running, of being hunted and hidden, have you ever regretted the choice your people made? Do you ever wish you had simply accepted the Council's offer and stayed silent? Kayla Moore stepped onto the transporter pad and turned to face her one final time. When he spoke, his voice carried the strength of a people who had endured the unendurable without losing their souls. Captain, there are fates worse than death, worse than exile, worse than being forgotten by history.
The worst fate of all is forgetting who you are in order to survive. We may be the galaxy's outcasts, but we are still ourselves.
We still believe that compassion matters, that principles are worth preserving, that someone must speak for those who cannot speak for themselves. If that makes us unsuitable for civilization, then perhaps civilization needs to change.
As Kalamore's form dissolved into energy and returned to his platform, Elena stood alone in the transporter bay, knowing that everything had changed. The routine exploration mission had become something much larger, much more important.
Humanity was about to face its first true test as a galactic power, and the choice they made would define their character for generations to come. She made her way back to the bridge where Morrison was already preparing the long-range communications array for transmission to Earth. As she settled into her command chair and looked out at the hidden platforms housing the galaxy's forgotten people, Elena Vasquez began composing what would become one of the most important messages in human history. The galaxy had forsaken the Kethvar, but humanity was about to declare that some things were worth standing for, no matter the cost. Admiral Sarah Chen stood before the assembled delegates in the United Earth Assembly, her crisp uniform bearing the insignia of humanity's highest naval rank. The chamber, carved from Luna's bedrock and surrounded by transparent aluminum allowing views of Earth hanging in the star-filled void, had never hosted a debate quite like this one. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber's acoustics, 63 hours ago, Captain Elena Vasquez made contact with a people the galaxy has chosen to forget. What she discovered challenges everything we thought we knew about galactic civilization. The holographic display behind her showed the Kethvar platforms, their massive structures dwarfed by the emptiness of space around them. The images were haunting, artificial worlds that should have been marvels of engineering reduced to desperate refugee camps by political decree. President Maria Santos leaned forward from her seat in the Assembly's front row. "Admiral, walk us through the strategic implications. If we offer formal recognition and protection to the Kethvar, what can we expect from the Council?" Admiral Chen had spent the better part of 2 days wargaming this exact scenario with her staff. The results were sobering but not decisive. "Mr. President, the Council has several options. Economic sanctions are almost certain. They'll target our trade agreements and technology exchanges. Diplomatic isolation is likely, though our recent contributions to galactic stability give us some protection. Military action is possible, though direct conflict would be expensive for all parties involved." Assemblymember Dr. H.A.C. James Wright stood from his position representing the African Federation. "Admiral, you're asking us to risk humanity's entire galactic position for a people we'd never heard of until 3 days ago. How do we justify that to our constituents?" Before Admiral Chen could respond, another voice cut through the chamber. "Because, Dr. Wright, sometimes doing the right thing matters more than doing the profitable thing." The speaker was Dr. Elena Rodriguez, Earth's most respected xenoanthropologist, and a woman whose opinion carried significant weight in matters of first contact and interspecies relations. She rose from her advisory seat, her silver hair catching the chamber's lighting. "I've spent my entire career studying how civilizations interact, how they rise and fall, how they define themselves in relation to others. The Kethvar situation presents us with a choice that will define humanity's character for centuries to come." Dr. Rodriguez moved to the chamber's center, her presence commanding attention. The Council didn't just exile the Kethvar for political disagreement. They created a system where compassion itself was pathologized, where caring about others became a mental illness. If we accept this precedent, we're not just abandoning the Kethvar, we're abandoning the principles that make us human. Assemblymember Liu Wei, representing the Asian Coalition, raised his hand. Dr. Rodriguez, with respect, principles don't protect colonies. Principles don't maintain trade routes. If the Council decides to treat humanity as they've treated the Kethvar, how do we protect our own people? With allies, came a new voice from the back of the chamber. Heads turned to see Captain Vasquez herself still bearing the dust of space travel, having arrived via fast courier ship only hours earlier. President Santos nodded for her to approach. "Captain Vasquez," the President said formally, "you've been granted emergency speaking privileges. Please share what you've learned." Elena walked to the podium with the measured pace of someone carrying vital information. "Thank you, Mr. President. Honored delegates, I've spent the last week among the Kethvar, learning not just about their exile, but about what they've accomplished despite it." The holographic display shifted, showing detailed scans of the refugee platforms. "These aren't just hiding places. They're marvels of sustainable engineering.
The HFY have developed technologies that could revolutionize resource management, closed-loop agriculture, and environmental preservation. Their forced nomadic existence has made them innovators in ways the Council species haven't even considered. Elena's voice gained strength as she continued. But more importantly, they're not alone. Each platform houses multiple species, beings who've fallen through the cracks of galactic civilization, people who were displaced by expansion, survivors of disasters the Council deemed too small to address. The HFY have become the galaxy's unofficial protectors of the forgotten.
Dr. Wright looks skeptical. Captain, that's admirable, but how does that change our strategic position? Elena smiled, and those who knew her recognized the expression that usually preceded a brilliant tactical insight. Because
Right, the HFY aren't just refugees, they're the nucleus of something much larger.
Over 4 decades of exile, they've made contact with dozens of species that feel marginalized by Council policies. Independent systems, frontier colonies, nomadic traders. There's an entire informal network of beings who've grown tired of Council dominance but lack the power to challenge it individually.
The implications hit the Assembly like a wave. Assembly member Grace O'Connor from the European Union stood slowly. Captain, are you suggesting the formation of an alternative alliance? I'm suggesting, Elena replied carefully, that humanity has the opportunity to be part of something new. Not a challenge to legitimate galactic authority, but an alliance of species committed to principles the Council has apparently forgotten. Mutual aid, protection of the vulnerable, democratic decision-making, and yes, the radical idea that compassion is a strength, not a weakness. Admiral Chen stepped forward again.
The military implications are significant. While individually these species lack the power to challenge the Council, collectively they represent substantial resources, strategic positions, and technological capabilities. An alliance built around protection rather than conquest could attract considerable support.
President Santos called for a brief recess, allowing the delegates to absorb the magnitude of what they were considering. In the corridors outside the chamber, intense discussions broke out as representatives contacted their home governments and advisors.
Dr. Rodriguez found herself surrounded by a group of younger delegates, all pressing for her assessment of the proposal.
Doctor, asked Assembly Member Kim Patel from the Indian Federation, in your professional opinion, could such an alliance actually succeed?
Dr. Rodriguez considered carefully before answering. The historical precedent suggests it's possible. Throughout galactic history, dominant powers have eventually faced coalitions of smaller entities united by shared principles.
The key is whether those principles are strong enough to overcome individual self-interest, and in humanity's case, pressed another delegate. In humanity's case, Dr. Rodriguez replied, we have something unique. We're new enough to the galactic stage that we're not deeply invested in the current power structure, but established enough to have credibility. More importantly, our history shows a consistent pattern of supporting underdogs and fighting for principles, even when it's costly. When the Assembly reconvened, the tone had shifted. President Santos stood to address the chamber.
We've received preliminary responses from our major governments. While there's concern about the risks, there's also recognition that this situation aligns with humanity's core values.
The question now is implementation. Admiral Chen returned to the podium.
We've developed a preliminary framework for what we're calling the Mutual Protection Alliance. Phase 1 involves formal recognition of HFY sovereignty and the establishment of humanitarian aid. Phase 2 expands to include other displaced species and marginalized systems. Discontent from beyond. Phase 3 involves the formal creation of an interstellar alliance based on democratic principles and mutual defense. Assemblymember Wright remains skeptical.
Admiral, you're describing a complete reorganization of galactic politics. The Council won't simply allow this to happen. You're absolutely right, Admiral Chen acknowledged, which is why we need to be smart about this. We're not declaring war on the Council or challenging their authority directly.
We're simply exercising our sovereign right to form alliances and provide humanitarian aid. If they choose to view that as aggression, it reveals more about their intentions than ours.
Captain Vasquez stepped forward again. There's something else the Assembly needs to know. During my time with the HFY, I learned about the other species they've helped over the years. Some of these beings possess technologies or resources that could be extremely valuable. The Council's loss could become humanity's gain, but only if we're willing to extend protection first. Dr. Rodriguez nodded approvingly. Captain Vasquez is describing the fundamental principle of alliance building. Trust must precede benefit. If we help the HFY and their allies because we expect immediate returns, the alliance will fail. If we help them because it's right, and allow mutual benefit to develop naturally, we create something lasting.
The debate continued for hours, touching on everything from economic projections to military logistics to the philosophical implications of challenging established galactic order. Through it all, one theme emerged consistently. This decision would define humanity's role in the galaxy for generations.
As the formal debate drew to a close, President Santos called for the preliminary vote. The question before the Assembly is whether to authorize the formation of humanitarian relationships with displaced species, beginning with formal recognition of HFY sovereignty. This vote will guide our government's policy but does not commit us to military action. The vote was closer than many expected, 147 in favor, 98 opposed, with 23 abstentions. It was enough to proceed, but the narrow margin reflected the genuine difficulty of the choice. President Santos stood as the votes were tallied. The motion carries.
Admiral Chen, you're authorized to begin immediate humanitarian contact with the HFY. Captain Vasquez, you'll return to your ship with a diplomatic mission and the authority to begin formal negotiations.
As the assembly dispersed, Elena found herself approached by Dr. Rodriguez.
Captain, you've set something in motion that will echo through history. I hope you understand the magnitude of what you've begun.
Elena looked through the chamber's transparent walls at Earth hanging in space, its blue marble surface hiding the billions of people whose future might be changed by this decision.
Dr.
Rodriguez, 47 years ago, the HFY made a choice to stand up for beings who couldn't protect themselves, knowing it would cost them everything. If humanity can't make the same choice when the stakes are actually much lower, then maybe we don't deserve our place among the stars.
Meanwhile, in a secure communication facility beneath Geneva, Admiral Chen was already coordinating with Fleet Command to redirect resources toward what was being called Operation Extended Hand. The initial phase would involve sending medical supplies, food, and technical assistance to the HFY platforms under the banner of humanitarian aid.
Admiral, ask her aide, Commander Patricia Walsh, what's our timeline for implementation?
72 hours. Chen replied without hesitation. If we're going to do this, we need to move before the Council has time to organize a response. Speed and accomplished facts are our best protection at this point.
Across the solar system, humanity's industrial capacity began shifting toward an unprecedented humanitarian mission. Ships were retrofitted for cargo duty, medical facilities prepared emergency supplies, and engineers began studying HFY technical specifications to determine compatibility needs. But perhaps most importantly, word began spreading through Earth's communications networks. The story of the HFY, their exile, their principles, their 47 years of wandering, captured the human imagination in ways that surprised even seasoned political observers. Dr. Maria Santos, the president's daughter and a prominent social media influencer, posted a simple message that would be shared millions of times. Today we learned there are people in our galaxy who've been homeless for 47 years because they refuse to stop caring about others.
What kind of species would we be if we didn't invite them home? The response was immediate and overwhelming. Humanitarian organizations mobilized. Private citizens organized donation drives. Artists began creating works inspired by HFY culture.
Within hours, support for the rescue mission had become a grassroots movement that transcended political boundaries. Captain Vasquez, preparing for her return journey aboard a ship now loaded with supplies and staffed with humanitarian workers, received a message that summarized the situation perfectly.
It came from her 10-year-old niece on Mars, Aunt Elena. Mom says you found some people who need help. I sent my allowance to help too. Thanks for finding them. As Elena read the message, she realized that whatever the political and military consequences of their decision, humanity had already passed the most important test. When faced with others' suffering, they had chosen compassion over convenience, principle over profit. Whatever happened next, they would face it as themselves. Flawed, idealistic, stubborn humans who refused to let cruelty have the final word.
The galaxy was about to discover that some species, when pushed to choose between survival and principles, would choose both, and find a way to make it work. Admiral Chen's final message to the fleet was simple but definitive. All units, prepare for humanitarian deployment.
We're going to remind the galaxy what it means to stand up for those who cannot stand up for themselves. Whatever comes next, history will remember that when it mattered most, humanity chose hope over fear. As the first ships launched toward HFY space, Earth hung in the darkness like a blue beacon of defiance against the cold calculations of galactic politics. The galaxy was about to learn that sometimes the newest voice in the conversation could speak the oldest truths with the most dangerous clarity.
The Galactic Council chamber on Nexus Prime had witnessed many dramatic moments in its 1,000-year history, but few could match the tension that filled the vast amphitheater as Ambassador Diana Chen stepped forward to address the assembled representatives of the galaxy's most powerful civilizations. The chamber itself was a monument to Council authority, a massive circular space carved from a single crystalline structure that amplified and translated speech into every known galactic language.
Tiered seating rose in concentric circles around the central speaking platform, with the 4 founding species occupying places of honor at the chamber's cardinal points. Diana had prepared for this moment throughout her diplomatic career, but nothing could have truly readied her for the hostility that radiated from the assembled delegates. The past 3 months had seen humanity's extended hand operation grow from a simple humanitarian mission into something that threatened the very foundations of galactic order. High Counselor Vextar of the Drakmor rose from his species' traditional position at the chamber's northern point. His massive frame, evolved for heavy gravity warfare, cast an imposing shadow even in the chamber's carefully neutral lighting. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of a species that had never known defeat.
Ambassador Chen, Vextar began, his translated words echoing through the chamber. Humanity stands accused of deliberate interference in galactic stability, violation of council decree regarding non-persons, and conspiracy to undermine legitimate authority. How do you answer these charges? Diana had rehearsed her response countless times. But standing before the assembled might of galactic civilization, she felt the weight of every word.
Behind her calm exterior, she carried the hopes of not just humanity but of dozens of species that had found new hope in humanity's willingness to challenge the established order. High Counselor, she replied, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. Humanity answers that we have violated no legitimate law, challenged no rightful authority, and undermined nothing but cruelty masquerading as civilization. The reaction was immediate. Delegates throughout the chamber erupted in protests, translation systems struggling to keep pace with the volume of outraged responses. Vextar's eyes, evolved for tracking prey across vast battlefields, fixed on Diana with predatory intensity. You dare question the authority of this council? He demanded. Your species has been granted membership as a courtesy, a recognition of your potential. Do not mistake tolerance for weakness.
Diana stepped forward, and those who knew her recognized the movement as distinctly human, a species that had evolved to face larger predators without backing down. High Counselor, I question any authority that declares compassion a mental illness and sentences billions to exile for the crime of caring about others. From the eastern point of the chamber, Zeta Prime B7, the current representative of the Zephyrian Collective, activated its communication array.
Unlike the organic species, the Zephyrians communicated through a complex interplay of light, sound, and electromagnetic radiation that required advanced translation matrices. When its message reached the chamber's speakers, the mechanical precision of the voice only made its contents more chilling. The human demonstrates the exact pathology that necessitated Kethvar isolation, Zeta Prime V7 declared. Emotional decision-making, irrational attachment to non-beneficial entities, willingness to sacrifice group welfare for individual sentiment. This confirms our analysis that prolonged contact with Kethvar elements induces similar psychological deterioration. Diana felt a cold anger building, not the hot rage that led to poor decisions, but the calculating fury that her species had learned to channel into revolutionary change. Zeta Prime VI, if caring about the welfare of others is mental illness, then humanity pleads guilty to the charge. We consider it our most valuable trait. The chamber's southern representative, Trade Master Kelnoth of the Veltar Consortium, gestured with one of his species' intricate manipulator arms. The Veltar had evolved from creatures that lived in complex underground trade networks, and their entire civilization was built around economic optimization. Kolnoth's response reflected that heritage. Ambassador Chen, emotion is not a valid basis for interstellar policy. The Kethvar situation was resolved through careful economic analysis. Their continued existence created market inefficiencies and resource allocation problems. The current arrangement optimizes galactic productivity while minimizing conflict. Your interference disrupts carefully balanced systems. Trademaster, Diana replied, her voice carrying a note of deadly calm that would have warned anyone familiar with human history. Humanity's analysis suggests that a civilization that treats people as resource allocation problems has failed the most basic test of legitimacy. The western point of the chamber remained silent. The ethereals, as always, observed without direct participation. Their representative, if it could be called that, was a shifting pattern of energy that existed in a containment field designed to allow their participation in solid matter environments. The ethereals had transcended physical existence eons ago. and their perspective on galactic affairs remained largely incomprehensible to younger species. High Counselor Vexter stood to his full impressive height. Ambassador, your species seems determined to court disaster. The Council's patience has limits. Withdraw from Kethvar space immediately, cease all humanitarian operations, and accept Council mediation of this situation. This is your final opportunity to resolve this matter peacefully. Diana had reached the moment that would define not just her career, but humanity's entire future in galactic civilization. Behind her, displayed on the chamber's viewing screens, were images from the past 3 months. Human ships docked with Kethvar platforms, integrated communities where human and Kethvar children played together, technological exchanges that had already led to breakthroughs in sustainable living and resource management. More importantly, the screens showed something the Council had not expected: other species joining the Alliance. The hardy miners of Keftar Prime, who had grown tired of Eltar economic exploitation. The aquatic depths dwellers of Oceanus, whose homeworld had been designated for development despite their protests. The nomadic cloud riders, whose freedom of movement had been restricted by new Council regulations. Dozens of species that had found in humanity's Protection Alliance the voice they had never been able to raise alone. High Counselor, Diana said, her words carrying the weight of decision, humanity respectfully declines your ultimatum. We will not abandon people who have asked for our protection. We will not cease humanitarian operations that violate no legitimate law. And we will not accept Council mediation of a situation the Council itself created through calculated cruelty. The silence that followed was profound. In the Chamber's 1,000-year history, no member species had ever rejected a direct Council ultimatum so completely. Vextar's response came in a voice that carried the promise of military action. Then humanity has chosen conflict over cooperation. The consequences will be severe. The consequences, Diana replied, will be what they have always been when people of principle face those who mistake power for righteousness. We will endure, we will adapt, and we will prove that compassion is not weakness but strength. As if summoned by her words, the Chamber's communication system activated to announce an incoming priority transmission. On the screens throughout the Chamber, a familiar figure appeared. Captain Elena Vasquez, now bearing the insignia of Commodore and speaking from the bridge of a ship that had become the symbol of human defiance. Council delegates, Elena's voice carried clearly through the translation systems. I speak to you from the UES Defiance, currently positioned at the edge of Kethvar space. I want you to understand exactly what you're threatening. The image shifted to show the view from Elena's ship, not the desperate refugee platforms the Council remembered, but a thriving community of integrated habitats. Kethvar engineering had been enhanced with human manufacturing capability. Human agricultural techniques had been refined with Kethvar sustainability expertise. The platforms had become prototype cities that represented a new model of interstellar civilization. 47 years ago, Elena continued, you exiled the Kethvar for refusing to abandon their principles. Today, those principles have created something remarkable.
These platforms house over 50 different species, all living in democratic harmony. They've developed technologies that could revolutionize galactic civilization, art that expresses truths you've forgotten, and children who are growing up believing that cooperation is stronger than competition.
Elena's image was replaced by others. Human doctors working alongside Kethvar healers to develop new medical techniques. Engineers from a dozen species collaborating on sustainable technology. Children of multiple species playing games that taught cooperation rather than dominance. You can destroy this, Elena said, her voice now carrying the weight of absolute conviction. You have the military power to scatter us across the galaxy, to reduce these communities to memory. But you cannot destroy the idea they represent. You cannot kill the proof that there is a better way to organize galactic civilization. Back in the Council chamber, Diana stepped forward for her final statement. Honorable delegates, humanity stands with the Kethvar not because we seek conflict, but because we refuse to accept that might makes right. We stand with them because 47 years of exile have proven that their vision of compassionate civilization is not only possible but superior to what we have now. She gestured to the images still playing on the chamber's screens. Look at what they've built despite your opposition. Look at what becomes possible when species work together rather than compete for dominance. You can sanction us, isolate us, even attack us, but you cannot make this vision disappear. High Counselor Vexter's response was immediate and decisive. The Council votes to implement comprehensive sanctions against humanity, effective immediately. All trade agreements are suspended. All technology exchanges terminated. All diplomatic recognition withdrawn. Any species that continues relations with humanity will face similar consequences.
But as Vexstar spoke, something unprecedented happened. Throughout the chamber, delegates began standing, not in support of the sanctions, but in silent protest.
The representative from the Healer Confederacy rose first, followed by delegates from the Artisan Worlds, the Frontier Alliance, and dozens of smaller civilizations. Trademaster Kelnoth's manipulation arms writhed in agitation.
This is highly irregular. Council procedure does not allow for silent protest during formal deliberations. Diana smiled, and those present would later remember it as the expression of a species that had spent its entire history turning impossible odds into victory.
Trademaster, with respect, this is not a council deliberation anymore. This is the birth of something new. The standing delegates began speaking, one by one, declaring their intention to maintain relations with humanity regardless of council sanctions.
What had begun as a human gesture of support for the Kethvar had become something much larger, a galactic movement toward a different kind of civilization. Within hours of Diana's speech, the political landscape of the galaxy had fundamentally shifted.
The Council's authority, built on the assumption that smaller species would always prioritize their individual survival over collective action, had met a force they had never anticipated: the infectious power of hope. Admiral Sarah Chen, monitoring the situation from Earth's Military Command Center, watched as long-range sensors detected movement throughout Council space. Ships were leaving their home systems, heading toward the coordinates humanity had broadcast as the location of the new alliance. It was not an invasion or an exodus, but something more dangerous to established power structures. It was choice.
Admiral, her aide reported, we're receiving formal requests for alliance membership from 47 different species or political entities. The communication traffic is overwhelming our translation systems.
Sarah nodded, feeling the weight of history. Open channels to all of them. Begin preliminary discussions immediately.
And send a message to Commodore Vasquez. Tell her that humanity stands ready to defend not just the Kethvar, but every species that chooses hope over fear. On the Kethvar platforms, Ton Kelamor stood before a mixed assembly of humans, Kethvar, and representatives from the growing alliance.
His bioluminescent patterns blazed with an intensity that spoke of vindication and hope in equal measure. My friends, he said, his words being translated into dozens of languages simultaneously. 47 years ago, we were told that our compassion made us unsuitable for civilization.
Today, we have discovered that our compassion is the foundation upon which a new civilization can be built.
The response was immediate and overwhelming, beings from across the galaxy expressing their support not through words alone, but through their willingness to risk everything for the chance to be part of something better. As Elena watched the celebration from her ship's bridge, she reflected on how far they had all come from that first desperate transmission 3 months ago. The galaxy had indeed forsaken the Kethvar, but in doing so, it had created the conditions for its own transformation.
Commodore, her communications officer reported, we're receiving a priority transmission from Earth. President Santos wants to speak with you directly. Elena nodded, knowing that this conversation would likely involve humanity's formal commitment to the path they had chosen. As she prepared to take the call, she looked out at the thriving communities that surrounded her ship, proof that when beings chose cooperation over competition, compassion over convenience, they could create something that was greater than the sum of its parts. The galaxy had forsaken the Kethvar until humanity declared, "We stand with you." Now it seemed half the galaxy was ready to make the same declaration.
The age of the Council was ending not through conquest or revolution, but through the simple recognition that there was a better way to live among the stars. In the end, the greatest victory was not political or military, but moral. The proof that in a universe vast and cold, intelligent beings could choose to care for each other, and that such choices, however difficult, were always worth making.
Forsaken by the galaxy, until humanity declared, "We stand with you." HFY.